Hey guys, today's episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast is presented by our 52-week Increase devotional. We released it a few months ago, and I'm telling you, if you want a devotional to go through with your kids, to go through with your friends, with your small group, your church group, maybe even your men's group, and you want to talk about sports and faith intersecting, you need to get the 52-week Increase devotional. It's available on Amazon and over at theincrease.com. That's a great place to go, by the way, for a ton of resources, theincrease.com. And this 52-week devotional features stories from athletes, coaches, many football players, baseball players, different people in the world of sports talking about their faith in Jesus. And many of the devotionals that are in there stem from conversations that took place right here on Sports Spectrum. So I highly recommend you pick up our 52-week Increase devotional. It's available right now on Amazon or at theincrease.com, the 52-week Increase devotional. Get your copy today.
This is Sports Spectrum, the intersection of sports and faith, where we bring Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
And hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I am Jason Romano. This is Sports Spectrum's podcast. We are the intersection of sports and faith. I've been doing this podcast now for 5 years. Can you believe that? 5 years doing this show. And I'm so grateful that God has provided this platform for me and so many others to be a part of. And all of our content, including 5 years worth of podcasts, can be found at sportspectrum.com. That's the website. That's where our home base is, with articles and podcasts and devotionals, all for free, available at sportspectrum.com. And if you'd like to reach me directly, you can email me. Jason@sportspectrum.com is my email address. Jason@sportspectrum.com. Now, today on the show, we got a bit of a different conversation than we normally have here on Sports Spectrum, but that's why I like the variety that we can bring you. Obviously, most of our guests are athletes and coaches and people associated with the world of sports who love Jesus. But then there's other people like authors and speakers and different types of people that may not be directly involved in the sports world, but they have a great story or they have a new book coming out. And today's guest, Kari Kampakis, is one of those people. She's the author of the book More Than a Mom: How Prioritizing Your Wellness Helps You and Your Family Thrive. So we're going to talk about parenting teenagers today, particularly teenage girls, which I'm the dad of a teenage girl, and I'm sure those listening, many of you are parents of a teenager as well. Now, Kari comes from a family that has rooted for and been involved with Alabama athletics for a long time. So we talk about Roll Tide a little bit with her and her fandom and her husband's fandom, and the fact that her daughter didn't go to Alabama. She went to that other school that Alabama doesn't root for or like so much. So there's that dynamic as well. But Kari has such a great heart. She's got a podcast as well called Girl Mom Podcast. She's written a bunch of books. Her work has been featured in places like The Today Show, Focus on the Family, Yahoo News, and others. So you're going to like this conversation, I think, with Kari Kampakis, author of the book More Than a Mom. She joins us here today on Sports Spectrum. Kari Kampakis, welcome to Sports Spectrum. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. So good to have you here on the show. Excited about your new book, More Than a Mom: How Prioritizing Your Wellness Helps You and Your Family Thrive. It's an interesting thought process as I was putting together my prep for this interview, because, and even you and I talked about it beforehand, this is probably a different audience than most of the interviews that you do or most of the podcasts that you're going to do in helping to promote this book. But there's a connection there. There really is. We have a lot of guys that listen who are married. So this book, by the way, makes a great gift for the woman in your life. But we have a lot of people who are family oriented and just trying to do the right thing and raising their kids and loving Jesus all at the same time, and loving sports, Kari, which you do. So let's start there. You love your Alabama Crimson Tide, don't you?
Yes. My husband and I are both huge Bama fans.
Where does that come from? Where does that come from?
Well, we went to Alabama for as undergrads and also for grad school. My dad played basketball at Alabama, so we just have a lot of ties there. And then the big irony and twist is that our oldest daughter decided to go to Auburn, so she's a freshman this year.
Oh
So
no. Did you like
I joke,
disown her? Did you disown
yeah,
her?
I know. That's what I joke. I was like, 5 years ago, I would have been like, no way. And then it actually came to it, and she just fell in love with the campus. So I was like, I can support everything except for the football. So it's made for an interesting year, but it was very satisfying going to the Iron Bowl this year, I have to say.
Yeah. Who is, your daughter walks out of there miserable and you're just, happy as can be. How does that work as a mom?
Well, we were laughing. We were like, afterward, we're like, I don't know if we should call her. We'll just wait. And she ended up calling us about 10 minutes later. And she's like, it is so doom and gloom around here. And we're just trying not to rub it in, but it was pretty fun.
That is a lot of fun. Describe from your perspective, and I say your perspective because every person's perspective is different, why football in Alabama is such a big deal.
Oh, that is a great question. I don't, I think I think it's just that feeling you get when you're at a game. And it's just, there are not many life experiences that give you that euphoria, especially when you love your team and you know the stories of the players and you've seen the ups and downs and, cheering for a team like Alabama. I mean, my husband and I've learned you do not leave with 5 minutes on the scoreboard. We had friends that left the championship game when we did that last minute comeback. And I would have been so mad if we'd missed that. So it's just the experiences and just the camaraderie of coming together. And I don't know, I just think there are very few life experiences where you get to experience that joy and that, you're rooting for somebody and these players. And just, like I said, the stories of what's happening on the field and what God is doing in their lives and just the life lessons. I mean, I think watching those football players and how they bounce back and how they'll have bad games or bad moments, but they still keep doing it. I mean, that's life. And I think we can find so many analogies in that, not only for ourselves, but also in parenting.
Absolutely. The ups and downs, if you will, right? And celebrating the highs and taking the lessons from the lows. There was a national championship game that didn't go Alabama's way. And I've talked to a couple Alabama people since that loss, and they said, listen, it's okay. You can't win every one of them. But for you, how were you able to handle watching that loss? And obviously you want to win every year. Alabama is a tad bit spoiled in the success that they've had from a football program, but there's lessons in losing too.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's the losing that's really when it gives you the humility that is so important in sports. And I guess for Bama fans, we know we have won an excessive number of times. And so for me, I was like, it's okay. And my husband was actually at that game with his friends. And, it was a huge disappointment at the time. But you also know this is Alabama fans. Like, we kind of get motivated by defeat. And so the mindset of a lot of our friends is, okay, next year we'll come back. And it might not happen, but we know that Alabama, they're great at recovery. They're great at bouncing back, learning from those mistakes. And again, I think the life lessons from that and just the resilience we see in our team and so many other college teams, that it's just neat.
Yeah. What's your favorite moment attending a game in person? Do you have a favorite game that you went to?
That championship where Tua won it for us.
Yeah.
That was, I told my husband, I was like, that's probably one of my top 5 favorite moments with you. In our whole marriage and dating experience, 25 years.
That was an incredible game, right?
Yeah. And then the next year when the tables turned and it was Jalen who did it for us. And just, like I said, that story that played out and just watching those guys just stay so faithful in their walk and knowing that they get their strength from Christ and just their trust in God and writing that story and being patient and waiting for their time and supporting their teammates. I don't know. I don't think that we could have written a better story than what played out.
That is true. You're the mom to 4 girls. We were talking beforehand. You'll never have 4 teenagers, but you're really close. You have 3 and one is 12 years old. So that's a lot to deal with and to work through. Take me through the role sports has played in the lives of your kids and being a mom and certainly your husband as a dad in the sports world, in the sports parenting world.
Yes. Well, my oldest 2 daughters did cheerleading, and then my 3rd daughter's a dancer, and the youngest one is trying out for cheerleading. And so it's different than football or basketball and some other sports, but it's a lot of the same lessons. And, probably it's funny, like my daughter that's at Auburn this year, everybody asked me, she's the sweetest roommate. We love the roommate. We love the mom. And everybody's like, how did you find her? And I was like, it's actually through cheerleading, but actually she quit cheerleading after 10th grade. She wanted to focus on her grades and she was just burned out. but her cheer coach always loved her. And so 2 years later, when she decided she wanted to go to Auburn, I remember that her cheer coach had been an Auburn cheerleader, and she was training my younger daughter at the time. And I told her we were looking for a roommate, and she was like, "Oh, you know what? My niece is thinking about going to Auburn." So she set them up. And I just think that's such a lesson of, like, the sports ends. You hang up your cleats, you hang up your pom-poms, whatever it is, but it's those relationships that last and that really carry through life, along with the life lessons. So that, and then, just the life lessons of, I had one daughter that didn't make the cheer team last year. And I thought it would just be devastating to her, and just watching her walk through that and handle it and get stronger. And then she decided this year that she's not even going to try out again. She's found other things. And this was a child that I would never have predicted that. This was probably her identity since fourth grade. I mean, she loved cheerleading. She loved her friends. And so just to see that she was okay without that. And I'm like, this is a life lesson that, you see things in your life, they might not last permanently, they're temporary. But that's why we got to find our identity in Christ, because that will always be permanent. And this is just a season of your life. And I don't know, just to see them walking through the highs and lows and the self-doubt. And I often tell my kids too, but I remember when the first one was trying out for cheer, and I'll spend a lot of money on trainers and coaches trying to get her ready, since tumbling and all that's so important. And she got in the car one day and she was like, what if I don't make it? I've worked so hard. You've spent all this money trying to get me ready. And I was like, you know what? It's worth it to me for these conversations we're having in the car and these life lessons you're learning. Some days you're feeling defeated. Some days you're feeling on top of the world, but this is preparing you for real life. And that's what I feel like I'm paying for, regardless of whether you make the team. But it took me a little time to get to that point as a parent, just to see that bigger picture.
Yeah. I mean, I think we try to live vicariously through our kids in some cases, whether they're cheerleading, whether they're playing sports. My daughter plays volleyball and softball, and I played high school sports and a little bit of college. And so I understand what it takes to be an athlete on that level, certainly not on the professional level. But you kind of live vicariously through your kids, and their commitment might not be what you want it to be. But at the same time, you want to cheer them on and you want to encourage them, and you want to let them know it's okay for them to go at the pace that they want to go, not at the pace that necessarily parents want us to go. And there's commitment as well, right? I mean, I'm sure you had that with kids cheerleading. I mean, there's commitment, there's dropping off and picking up and practices, and I don't know what else, probably competitions and all of that.
Yes, definitely. And even I shared a story on my Facebook page this morning of my daughter who dances. That she loved it. She was one of those little girls that was always dancing around the house. Like, that was her track. And then in fifth grade, I let her do this competitive team. And in my mind as a mom, I'm like, okay, this is our track. She'll try out for the dance team at the junior high. And then at the end of the year, she's like, I want to quit dance. And I was like, no, you can't. Like, you're so good and you've worked so hard. But she's like, no, I'm done with it. And as a mom, I wanted to push it but I knew I couldn't, because I was like, this has to be her decision. So I really made her think about that decision for several months. I was like, let's just not make a rash decision. You've wanted to quit before. And so I really let her think about it. She was so adamant she wanted to quit. So it was hard for me to let go of it as a mom, but I did. But the funny thing was, 8 months later, she texted me from her friend's house randomly and said, hey, Mom, I want to try out for the dance team, the junior high dance team. It was, we had 2 months to get ready. And I'm like, what in the world? But it turned out her friends had talked her into it. They're like, you're so good. You should try out. Yeah. So we got her back in with a coach. She ended up making the team. And now she's been dancing for 3 years on that team. And she absolutely loves it. And I often think, like, I don't think this would have happened if I'd pushed it. She might have quit dance forever if I'd made her do it another year. And it was such a lesson to me as a parent, is that we don't want them making those rash decisions, but also listening to our children when they say they're burned out or they don't want to do it, like really exploring those feelings and helping them trust their own instincts as they make these decisions. But that can be so hard to do as a parent sometimes.
There's a lot that's hard to do as a parent, Kari. Yeah. Your new book is called More Than a Mom. We're going to talk about it in a second. I want to talk about your faith in Christ. Where does that stem from? Because just hearing Alabama makes me think, or growing up in the South, there's sort of the Bible Belt and you're sort of entrenched in church. But I talk to many people, and there's still a difference between growing up with it and making Christ your Lord and making that faith your own. Can you take me through that journey with Christ that you've had?
Yes. I grew up Catholic. I went to a Catholic school until 7th grade. My dad and my mom are both very faithful, and my dad still goes to church every day. He's one of those Catholics, does, the rosary in the car. I mean, just full blown, but so I grew up with it, and that was just what I always knew. And, it's funny looking back, I think I always had anxiety and didn't realize it, but I was your typical people pleasing child. I wanted to do well. I was a high achiever, very motivated, but I put a lot of pressure on myself. And I just grew up like my dad would always tell me. Luckily, I had a dad who did this. He was like, Kari, did you do your best? And I was like, yes. And he's like, if you did your best, there's nothing else you could have done. So you just do your best and leave the results to God. And I'd mentioned my dad was an athlete, and he just took a lot of those lessons from athletics too and applied it to life. And he never put that. It wasn't always about the result. This has to happen or life is over. It was basically you do your best and leave the results to God. And that just gave me so much peace growing up. But I don't feel like, I always went to church, but I don't feel like my faith really took off until I probably hit my 40s and just parenting and, struggling. And, I think that for women, especially, you can think I'll build this perfect little life and everything's turning out just great. And then you have a child who's struggling, or you're struggling as a mom and you're yelling at your kids. You're just realizing your human weaknesses. And so, and then we did this year, it was, a tree fell in our house. Like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And it just brought me to my knees. I felt like it broke me. And the one thing that brought me peace was just my relationship with Christ and really digging into my faith. And so, especially now that my kids are teenagers and growing up, I have to rely on my faith so deeply.
Yeah.
Or, when I'm worried about something, because, as your kids grow up or you get to be in your 40s, like I am, just life gets really hard. And like big league stress starts to happen, some tragedies and hard things you're walking through. And I don't know how people do it without that relationship with Christ.
I could not agree more. And, I'm in my 40s as well, late 40s. And I just see more, the older you get, the more you're going to have to struggle to walk through. And you mentioned tragedies, and just people that you have been in your life forever are suddenly getting older and passing away as well. And so there's a lot to navigate. And I don't know how people do it without faith either. But at some point for you recognized that you were given this platform by God to be a voice for a lot of people, writing books. This is your fourth book, More Than a Mom. You're hosting a podcast, social media, and all this. Like, where does that kind of begin to take shape, where you realize, okay, God, you're opening up a door here and with this platform to be a voice for moms, to be a voice for girls? It's such a cool platform that you have, but you got to kind of step out into it and say yes a lot of times. How does this all take place for you?
Yes. I guess if I was really looking back, in my 30s, I had, these 4 little girls, and my husband was commuting. He wasn't getting home until late at night. So I started writing fiction at night just as my escape. And I wasn't writing Christian fiction. I was writing chick lit, which was kind of popular at the time. But it was just something I was doing for myself. And I really got into that. I wrote 3 fiction novels. Nothing ever happened, experienced tons of rejection with that. And I look back and I say that God was preparing me. He was toughening me up a little bit, getting me used to that rejection, and which I needed. And anyway, it was 7 years after that. It was around the time when I was going through a lot of personal things that were deepening my faith. I'd written this article about teenage girls and what teenage girls should know. And I had some faith components in there. And, I'd been trying to get published for 7 years at that point. And so anyway, that blog post was my first post to go viral, which means, obviously just got a lot of shares. And it was about a week later, when things were starting to die down with that I got a random email from Thomas Nelson. And they said, hey, we saw this blog post. We're interested in turning it into a book. And so for me, I'm a planner in life. I feel like I have that false sense of control. I can make things happen. But like things like that never happened to me, where it just falls into my lap, but I'd been writing for 7 years at that point. So anyway, that opened the door to write this Christian book for teenage girls. I found out later that they said that it had been 10 years since they'd had a book for teenage girls. And so they were looking for the material. And so again, it's just me, I just realized that's God's timing, and that I'd trained. Those 7 years that I spent writing those fiction books were not a waste, because I do feel like it made me a better writer. I went to a lot of writing conferences, but I wasn't quite writing the material that I felt like he was calling me to write. And I could never really have total peace with that. But then once I started writing for the teenage girls, I did have peace. And I felt like, okay, this is something I can really pursue full speed ahead. And so anyway, so I wrote the 2 books for the teenage girls. That my girls were younger at the time. I talked to these moms at events, and they were like, when are you going to write a book for us? And in my head, I'm thinking never, because moms are a hard audience,
Yes.
But what happened is my girls grew up. My oldest daughter, she became a middle schooler, and we started butting heads and having some issues. And I just adopted that narrative in the world that teenagers are a pain, and you just got to, show them who's the boss. And I tried that strategy, and it did not work. It just created a bigger gulf between us. So it was one day, she and I just had this big fight over something dumb before school. And she goes to school, and I just had a breakdown moment in my closet, just crying. And at the time I was writing these books for teenage girls. So I'm like, nobody can ever know about this because I'm supposed to be this expert. And here I am. I can't even get along with my own daughter.
Right.
So that moment really was a moment of humility, just breaking me down and making me realize that maybe I was part of the problem. And maybe it was the way I was parenting her was part of the problem. So that led to a 5-year journey. And that led to my third book, which is called Love Her Well. And this is the great thing about God's redemption and his grace, is like that story that I didn't want anybody to know about, me crying on my closet floor. That was the opening story to that book. And even when I started writing that book, within 2 weeks, I knew God gave me this vision. I was like, I'm supposed to write this book. I'm not even going to tell my agent yet. I'm just going to write it. I don't want any of the distractions there, me thinking about marketing or who's going to publish it or anything. So I was full speed ahead writing it. And then my daughter and I started having another season of butting heads as I was writing it. And so I really doubted myself. I was like, maybe I'm not qualified to write this. Like, who am I to write this book? And I can't even get along with my daughter once again. And I felt God telling me that a lot of the moms reading the book were going to feel exactly the way that I felt in that moment. And that would keep me at a place of humility as I wrote it, and a place of compassion for other moms. And that I needed to keep doing it because that's how they were going to be feeling, many of them. And it is funny that I've had so many readers told me that I'm crying on page 3 and I'm exactly where you were crying on the closet floor. And I'm so glad you didn't give up writing that book. So what I thought would undermine my credibility, admitting that I struggle with my kids still, even though I'm writing these parenting books and I'm not the expert, that actually is what helped the moms relate to me more. And again, I think it's such a testament to God's grace. And when we don't pretend that we're perfect and when we admit our own struggles, it really connects us more to other moms and makes us more helpful to other parents.
Oh, wow. It's so funny. There's a couple things there. First of all, you're saying you're butting heads with your teenage daughter. And I'm thinking, well, so does my wife and so do I. And I'm glad we're not the only ones. And that's probably part of why you just told that story, because you realize there's so many other people going through things that you've walked through. I felt that way when I wrote my first book about forgiveness, and it was about my butting heads, if you will, but a tough relationship with my alcoholic dad. And so I tell that story, and suddenly you have people coming and saying, yeah, I have that issue with my dad too, or my mom, and I am having trouble forgiving that person who hurt me. And you realize, oh, okay, so it's not about being perfect. It's just telling your story. And we hear cliche wise, Kari, we hear that, right? Be transparent, be vulnerable. But it's really hard to put your own story out there and think, yeah, this is going to help someone else when I'm going through an absolute disaster right now.
Right. I agree 100%. And I think the enemy wants us to believe that. That's why we, wants us to believe that we have to be perfect. And I think in the world we live in, and I tell moms this all the time, especially when you're raising teenagers, that, you've got to know that these teenagers, all they see is this perceived perfection online. And I often think of this teenage girl. She was 17 years old, and she was having this heart-to-heart talk with her parents and this Christian retreat, and just really broke down into tears. And she basically told them that, you two are so perfect. I feel like I can never measure up.
Wow.
And her parents were heartbroken. They didn't mean to be perfect, but I think sometimes we're trying so hard to be good role models. And I'm not saying we should share and dump all of our problems and our struggles on our kids. Like, there are certain things we take to adults, but I'm like, I'm not scared to show my humanity to my children. And even when my mom passed away, I remember my daughter heard me over talking to a friend one day, and she was asking how I was doing. And I was like, I totally broke down earlier, had a good cry, but I'm doing okay now. And I got off the phone, and my daughter was like, wow, you're so honest, Mom. But I was like, I want you to see this, because I didn't see my mom grieving her mother. So I wish I'd had that blueprint. Plus, I was like, it's my friends can't help me if I'm not opening up and being honest about how I'm struggling. And so I've tried to be very intentional in letting my kids see my humanity. And many times I don't have to be intentional because I'm always making mistakes or doing things, but I try to just show myself grace in front of them. Like, I am so sorry I forgot this, or I dropped the ball on this, but I'm going to make it right, because I want them to take that approach to their life too, and not just beat themselves up every time they make a mistake, because we're human and we live in a world that doesn't leave any room to be human anymore.
Yeah. Oh, that's so well said. More Than a Mom is the book. We're going to talk more about what is in the book and sort of the drive behind it in a second. But I do want to ask you one more question about something I recently saw on your Instagram page. And you asked a question. I like your Instagram page because it's got some personal stuff, but sometimes it just puts out questions and things to ponder. And you simply said, what do kids need most to succeed? And I thought, all right, I'm going to ask that question to you. I saw the answer because you answered it on Instagram, but I'd rather you answer it here for the audience that hasn't seen your Instagram page, but also explain your answer a bit. So what is it that kids need most to succeed?
It is empathy.
Mm.
It's a word you really don't hear a lot about. And that post came from a TED talk that I'd given at our junior high several years ago on empathy. And that was inspired by a book by Dr. Michelle Borba. And she is this empathy expert. She's been researching it for 25 years, but it really is fascinating. And I know as a writer, I start off that post with saying that my first writing class, this instructor was he was Stephen King's first editor. So
Wow.
of course we were all fascinated, like, what that is so cool, kind of scary, but what was he like?
Yeah.
But he's like, I'll tell you the key to being a great writer, a great storyteller, and what he really had in spades, what Stephen King has in spades is empathy. He can really put himself in somebody else's shoes. And so that just got me thinking, I think we all love a good story. We find so much empathy with our favorite fictional characters. And yet in real life, we don't do that with other people. And I think that our world has become so narcissistic, and, social media is not helping us. We can get very self-focused. Yeah. And even in the work that I do with girls, and as teenagers are it's kind of a narcissistic season of life anyway. You're thinking about yourself a lot. But, the work I do with girls, I see a lot of pain in friendships. And I think a lot of it boils down to, we spend a lot of time thinking about how are my friends making me feel? How am I feeling? But yet we're not thinking, well, how am I making this person feel? Or, this person lost her grandfather. Like, have I done anything to reach out to her? And sometimes we don't really have empathy until we go through something, until we lose somebody. And I remember my daughter saying that when we lost my father-in-law. She was like, I feel so bad now for my friends who lost grandfathers before this, because I wasn't there for them like I should have been. I just didn't know how badly it hurts. Yeah. And so I think that is the upside of pain in our life, is it can make us more empathetic and compassionate. And knowing that with our kids, that, when they go through these hard things, that even if they go through a terrible mistake, that it's not a waste, and God can use it to grow their heart for others and to make them less judgmental and more empathetic to other people.
So well said. Empathy is the great game changer. I tell people this all the time. If you want to live a life where you're bitter and you're angry and you're upset about things, man, all you got to do is change the game by thinking, from an empathetic perspective on what the other person is going through. And it changes your mindset. It changes your focus. It makes you more compassionate, makes you more caring. And I think it makes you more forgiving when you yes. live a life of empathy. I really do. So thank you for sharing that. I think empathy is a great game changer. I also think your book is going to be a game changer. More Than a Mom releases April 5th. Most of the audience is men, and I think, and kids too, men or boys and girls who listen, who love sports and love Jesus. But like I said earlier, almost all these men have wives. So this is like the perfect gift. Mother's Day is coming up soon. So I'd love to hear you kind of share a little bit about your heart in the book.
Yes. And, I was thinking one tie-in really for your audience is like, where do we find our identity? I think a lot of your listeners, especially if they've played sports, and for men, maybe growing up, it's common for males to find their identity in sports or whatever you're gifted at. Yeah. And my husband and I have this conversation. I think for men, they tend to find their identity in work and career. And it's interesting. I can listen to my husband meeting my friend's husband, and within 60 seconds, they both know what each one does for a living. They know all about each other's business. And so, but for women, we tend to find our identity in motherhood. And especially when we've been doing it a long time, I mean, what greater purpose in life is there? And what I realized is, like, I was writing this book, I've been parenting for almost 20 years. And, with my 4 girls, it's like, you're just all in all those years. And then one day you wake up and your daughter's driving and they're going to college. And yes. I'm like, whoa, I've like totally wrapped my life around them, and they don't want me suffocating them. It's like the more I try to cling to them, the more they try to push me away. And so it was really a matter of like, pivoting in my life and seeing my role as, I'm not just a mom. Like, my greatest identity is my identity as a child of God. And I think when we see ourselves as women, our worth is not going to be tied to how our spouse is treating us or how our children are treating us, which is so important in the teenage years because they're not always being very loving back. But I think when we can find our strength and our identity in God and pull our strength from Him, then it allows us to turn around and love our people well, regardless of whether they're loving us well in return. And I think that's my biggest lesson in writing this book is like, what is going to keep us strong as mothers? We need friendships, we need rest, we need to know our worth is in Jesus and to find our identity there. We need hope, we need joy in our life, we need a sense of purpose, even as our children leave home. And as we strengthen ourselves internally, it allows us to turn around and be effective parents. And I think also it makes us better guides for our children as they get older, because I often think, and your daughter's almost there, I mean, really, as our children get older, they have 1,000 voices they can listen to. They have a lot of people they can turn to. And so I'm always thinking, okay, what's going to keep me connected to them? Like, what's going to help my relationship? And it really is being that voice of wisdom, that, offering good advice and guidance when they need it. I want to be that call that they make. And so I think for me to be that person in that season of life, I've got to really work on getting myself in a healthy minded place so that they want that advice. I still call my dad all the time. He's 86 years old, but he just gives me that nugget I need. He's very wise. He always comes from a Christian perspective. I remember a few years ago, I had an article this huge website wanted to publish, and they were like, we love it, but we think if we take out the God part, we'll get more shares. And I didn't want to do it. It was early on in my career, but I needed somebody to tell me why I didn't want to do it. So I called my dad, and he was like, no, Kari, it's not worth it. He's like, that article is temporary. God is forever. And I was like, that's exactly what I needed. Thank you, Dad. And so the irony was, in that article, we left it in there, and it ended up being one of their top articles of the year. It got like 1 million shares. So I felt like God gave me that little reminder. But I think about, if my dad wasn't in a healthy minded place, giving me that advice, if he was just worried about me losing this opportunity because I wouldn't take that out, if he was, parenting with a present focus, then, things might have turned out very differently. But yet, his advice that he gave me kept me coming back for more. And I think, that's the kind of parent I want to be to my children as they grow up.
Absolutely. More Than a Mom. People need to go get it. Releases April 5th. And it's crazy to think April and then May is Mother's Day. And wow, here we go with summer. So if you're looking for a good summer read as well, especially for your wife, consider More Than a Mom. I actually think I'm going to get myself a couple copies, especially for my wife, because like I said, Kari, our daughter is 17. She's going to be 18 in June. And we're going to be empty nesters because we only have one kid in the fall when she goes away to college in Indiana. So we have to kind of learn how to be married again without a child in the house. But I think my wife probably, and I probably am guilty of this too, have to learn how to be more than just mom and dad here. So this book sounds like one that we got to get as well. So congratulations on it. Really excited for people to pick it up. My last question to you, it's a question we ask all of our guests here on the show. What has God been showing you and teaching you in the season of life that you're in right now? What are you learning from God?
I think the main thing I'm learning is just humility and just, being not so quick to judge other people. And, I was thinking about this the other day. I have a friend that says her dad used to always tell her, when you have one finger pointing towards someone, you have 3 fingers pointing back towards yourself. And I think it's so hard. We live in a world where everybody's jumping on social media trains, and, it's just so easy to jump into all of that and to judge other people, but we don't know people's stories. And I think just learning to be humble. And if I'm tempted to judge somebody, just look at myself first and all the things that I'm getting wrong, and just all the grace that God has shown me in the past, and just trying to be that kind of person that is quick to show grace, that's quick to reach out to somebody who's struggling, because that's what I would want in my life. And I think the older I get, the more I value that type of person.
Yeah, that's good. We've talked about humility. We talked about empathy. We've talked about grace. We've talked about football too, Kari. We covered a lot here. Parenting. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for being here on Sports Spectrum. All the best to you. Congrats on the book. And hopefully we'll do it again down the road.
I'd love it. Thank you, Jason.
And many thanks to Kari Kampakis for joining us today on Sports Spectrum. Go pick up her new book, More Than a Mom. Releases April 5th. How prioritizing your wellness helps you and your family thrive. Guys, if you're listening, go get this book for your wife. I'm going to get it for my wife. And I think it's a important reminder for the many moms that are out there. Maybe you're a mom listening right now. You're incredible, right? You do amazing work. We'd be lost. I know for me as a dad, I'd be lost. I think my daughter would be lost as well without having her mom, my wife, in her life. And so, but also reminding them that they're more than just a mom, that they're actually, their identity doesn't have to be in just being mom. It can be in something bigger and greater, starting with Jesus. So go pick up the book, More Than a Mom by Kari Kampakis. She was great today on Sports Spectrum. We appreciate her for being here. We thank you as well for tuning in. I say it on every episode, but I really mean it. This show does not happen without you listening, tuning in, telling someone about the conversations that we're having here on Sports Spectrum. Check it all out at sportspectrum.com. Whatever app you're listening to this podcast on, please do us a great favor and click that subscribe or that follow button so that you never miss an episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast. Tell someone about the show, and then please do tune in next time for another episode, another edition of Sports Spectrum's podcast, Keeping Jesus in the Sports Conversation. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.